Mornings with Intention podcast where we bring you stories from around the globe. Well, hello. Welcome to another beautiful episode on Rise and Thrive Mornings with Intention. And today I have my beautiful guest back, Natasha Rosewood. Welcome. And you're looking wonderful today.
Thank you, Ava. In honor of this podcast, I thought I'd put on my old uniform, and it's amazing I can still get into it. But it's I thought it would add to the flavor of the podcast about flying.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for doing that. I really love it. And for those who haven't seen our previous episode, I strongly recommend you watch it. But for those, if it's your first time, Natasha, please tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from.
Okay, well, I was born in England, and I immigrated to Canada in 1983. Before then, I was a flight attendant for 8 years. I flew for three airlines actually. One was called Dan Air. It was one of the largest airlines in the UK, but had very unsafe aircraft, so I had quite a few adventures. And then the second one was Laker, and I'm wearing the Laker uniform now. I flew for them for 3.5 years, and sadly, they went into bankruptcy. It was a sign of the times. And then because they went into bankruptcy and there was a recession on, I ended up actually going to Libya for 3 months and flying for Gaddafi's airline, Libyan Arab Airlines. So that was a very big adventure. I haven't written about that yet, but I've written about the two first airlines, and we had a lot of fun.
Oh, that's
So that when
amazing.
I came to Canada, sorry, well,
No,
after I
no,
came
go
to
ahead.
Canada, I was always interested in palmistry. Even when I was flying, I would grab people's hands and say, "Can I read you? I don't know what I'm talking about, but I just want to practice." And they would be shocked at what I would see for them. And so when I came to Canada, I could pursue that. I got into metaphysics in a very big way and human consciousness, human potential. I went to all the workshops, I did all the things of the time. And fast forward, 30, 40 years, I'm still have a very busy practice doing readings, ghost busting, quantum healings, past life regressions. I've written 5 books. 3 of them are on metaphysics, 2 of them on flying. I do workshops and public speaking, TV and radio. So I just want to get the message out to people that we are all much more powerful than we think we are and to empower them to meet that potential.
Wow, that's amazing. And I've always been fascinated by flying and flights. I've flown the little planes myself too, and so it's definitely an interesting area. But tell us, your journey from skies to the spirit world is fascinating, actually. And you got to watch the other podcasts as well. But what was the spark that shifted you from flight attendant to intuitive spiritual healer? Like, what was it really that made you
Well,
shift?
I think in my Dharma, I think we all have a movie script for our lives. And I thought it was very interesting that I started flying at 22. My life actually took off, excuse the pun. And at the same time, I found this book on palmistry. So they always felt linked somehow. There were two paths that I was working on concurrently. So when, I flew for 8 years and I think I was done by then. I'd had quite a few adventures and I had my languages, which made it more interesting and I was more engaged with more international, types of people. So that really added another element to it. But by the time I came to Canada, I missed it. I missed the lifestyle. I missed the people. I missed the adventures, of course. But I didn't want to go back into flying. I wanted to do something much more creative at the time. So I moved to Vancouver and I found this bookstore called Banyan Books on a street in Vancouver. I think it was 4th Street. And it was just full of all these metaphysical books. And I just felt like a kid in a candy store.
Mm.
And to me, it was another adventure. It's like the adventure of the mind and the limitlessness of it. And so I just sought out people who knew what they were talking about. I went to workshops, classes, read tons and tons and tons of books on life after life, psychics. I went to see many, many psychics myself, and I would study how they read and whether I felt they were good or they were, how they did. I was fascinated by what they did and how they did it. So in the meantime, I was still reading people, and 6 months after I arrived in Canada, so not long after I'd stopped flying, I read this. No, sorry. As soon as I showed up in Canada, it was about a month later, I read a friend of my sister-in-law's. We were in the keg restaurant at the time, and I was sitting there reading a hand, and all the late waiters started lining up, going, poking their hands in my face. Can you read me?
No
Can you
way.
read me? Anyway, I read her, and I saw this scene where she would be driving down this long straight road with tall trees. She was with a man in a convertible Mercedes, and he wore glasses sometimes, but not all the time. And he traveled, so he came and he went. He described his hair and his look. And I don't think I had his name. I might have had his name. I can't remember. Anyway, 6 months later, after I'd done this reading, my sister-in-law called me and she said, "You know, Natasha, you're a witch." And I said, "Well, thanks a lot." She said, "No, you know, the reading you did on my friend came true absolutely." And that's when I got the title for my first book because I literally had this thought, I think I'm psychic. But getting back to the flying thing, I think it's because when you're flying, you're obviously above the clouds. You know, you're looking down on Earth. And especially when you're flying at night and you're coming into a city and you see all the lights and the cars, the lights of the cars, and you can tell everybody's running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And all they can see is in front of them, behind them, and to the side. And sometimes, sometimes behind. But when you're in the spirit and you're above and you're looking down, you can see this whole plan and you can see what's over there and over here. And you don't want this person to be driving down that road because there's been an accident or roadworks or something. So you get a different perspective, I think, when you fly. And I do know that all my colleagues there, we were all in our 20s, we're all looking for Mr. Right and romance, and we're all loving our jobs and buying houses and whatever. But we all took ourselves off to psychics at that time. We are all fascinated. And maybe it's got something to do with being a flyer and thinking, sometimes about death. Are we going to make it? Are we not going to make it? I definitely had some fearful moments. Um, so maybe that kind of brings it up to the front as well. Like, what does my future look like? But spirituality wasn't a big thing while I was flying, but I was very interested in trying to understand the chaos in the universe, trying to make sense and order out of the chaos.
Beautiful. Wow. So, I want to jump into the books a little bit. Can you tell us more about the inspiration behind Flight of Your Life and The
Okay,
Longest Flight of Your Life? How does these two books tie into your personal transformation? I love that. I love that cover.
that came to me in my head. Um, well, I told these flying stories because they were so funny. Just to, you know how it goes in conversations. You meet people and they'll ask you, "Did anything bad happen to you?" And I'm like, "Well, yes." So, and just the other day, we were out for lunch, and somebody asked me, "Well, you don't need to encourage me very much to tell stories." So off I went, and people actually begged me to write these stories down, and they said they're so funny and they're so outrageous, and we learn about so much about humanity when you're in a slim metal tube at 35,000 feet and you've got different nationalities going on and different ages and different quirks and fears and personalities, that there was never ever a dull moment. And so I decided, actually, this was during COVID. I want to say, for me, God bless COVID, because it gave me the time to finish these two books. So The Flight of Your Life is about Dan Air, that's the short haul. So I was based in Gatwick, flying on these old planes all over Europe. And at the time, I spoke German, French, and Italian. And in the first couple of years, and then later I learned Norwegian and I've picked up some Spanish as well. But I think because I had these languages, they flew me the whole year round. And normally during the winter, you get a break. There wouldn't be so many flights, but all the flights from Gatwick in the winter were to the snowy countries, so Scandinavia, Germany, Austria, Switzerland. So I kept flying throughout, so I was very exhausted. But Dan Air was, because I think it was a dangerous airline, um, I think there was so much camaraderie between the girls that we were very close knit, and we just laughed all the time. And I come home from flights, my cheeks would be aching because I'd just been laughing so much. We'd laugh at ourselves, at the passengers, at the plane. I'll just give you an example. I flew with a girlfriend of mine, and on the Comet, when we took off, especially at night, the condensation would cause water to accumulate just underneath the hat rack, and it would start dripping on the passengers. And this one man said to my girlfriend, "Excuse me, dear, but there's water falling down." He was worried that there was something drastically wrong with the aircraft. And she said, "Well, don't tell everybody, they'll all want it." So we'd always come up with these really funny retorts to make us laugh, to make the passengers laugh, because what else are you going to do? Say it's
Yeah.
a really old aircraft, it should be in a museum, but we're still flying on
Yeah.
these old aircraft. So we would just come up with really funny one-liners. And
I
they're
love that.
very British humor, of course,
Yeah.
but you get it because you've got a great sense of humor. Most people go, huh? But afterwards they get the humor, and we just have a lot of fun.
Yeah. What was another one of your funniest stories you like to share with us? Maybe something
Oh,
from the book?
oh my gosh. Well, I think the funniest story is when we actually lost a passenger. So we got on the 111, and the flight was going from Manchester to Glasgow, so it wasn't flying terribly high, which was a very good thing. And there were some older people on the flight, and we do what we do, what we call a head count. So we've closed the doors, and well, before we close the doors, we count the number of passengers. So yeah, we've got 89. That agrees with the manifest, and away they go. And so I went into the flight deck, confirmed with the captain, had 89 passengers, and he said, "Well, the rear door is open." I went, "What? I've closed the rear door." He said, "No, it's open." So I said, "Okay." I think I'd asked another girl to close it, and maybe I thought she'd, done it. So I thought maybe she didn't do it properly. So I went down to the back and closed the door. And then I'm walking back up towards the front, the flight deck, towards the flight deck. And this little old lady who's Scottish says, "Oh dear, I don't know. I'm a bit worried about my husband. He went to the loo and he hasn't come back." And I went, "Oh no, I hope he hasn't died in the toilet because this happens, people." And I thought, I'm
Oh,
having visions of having to find this old man with his trousers around his ankles.
oh my goodness.
So we went back down and looked in the loos, but there was nobody there. And I went, "Well, there's nowhere to hide on an aircraft." So I looked at the door and I went, "Oh my God, no." Could he by accident have gone down the back and instead of going to the toilets, which are on either side, gone through the door there? I mean, you have to pull the lever down.
Yeah.
And if he'd done that, he would have opened the door and stepped into darkness. And it's just steps, actually, the steps. So the door is like this, and the
Yeah.
rear stairs come up like this. So there's a gap, and this forms the rear of the aircraft. And on either side of that stairwell is an engine, two engines, very, very loud. So, and oh no. So I looked through the peephole. There's a peephole in the door, and I could see something white. And I went, "Oh dear." So oh, this is after takeoff. I'm so sorry. Forget the sequence now. So I went up to the captain and I said, can we open the door? And he said, "Well, we're not completely pressurized, but no, we can't. We'll have to wait till we get to Glasgow." So this poor man was in the stairwell. It's about a 45-minute flight, 45-minute to an hour flight. Anyway, we landed and we called an ambulance just in case, but thankfully he was still alive. He complained about the in-flight service. No drinks in the stairwell,
Wow.
but he survived it. So that was pretty funny for us,
Wow.
But thank
Oh,
God he lived. He lived
thank
to tell
goodness
the
he's
tale.
okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. Oh,
So
yeah, I
you wouldn't
know.
believe, people say they're afraid of planes going down. And I say to my husband, it's not the plane you should be afraid of, it's the people in the plane
Yeah.
because they get up to all kinds of um, other things.
Yeah. Well, wow. I'm sure you have many other amazing stories in the book. So, I encourage you guys to who are listening to get a copy. I'm sure there's lots of amazing stories. So tell me, were there any moments in the air that felt like divine interventions or near misses that later maybe made sense on a spiritual perspective?
Well, that reminds me too of another story again with Danair. We were on the Comets, which they were the first commercial aircraft, actually. And the first few of them, there were a few, they had three plane crashes before they figured out that um, the what do we call it? The metal fatigue built up around the corners. So then that's why we have round windows in airplanes now. But they were very old, and they'd actually put them in the museum. And Danae went to the museum and said, "These planes have 500 more hours. Let's get them out." So
Oh,
we're on
wow.
one of these comets, and it was, I hate to say it, it was a dark and stormy night. It was November, and we were all called out for this flight. And I never used to like that feeling because it felt fatalistic somehow. And it was dark, and I was tired, and I didn't want to do the flight. So we're walking across the tarmac to the plane, and it's black and it's rainy, so it's shiny on the tarmac. And I was just thinking, I don't have a good feeling about this, but we
Mm.
got on the plane. We're going to Stuttgart. I was one of the German speakers, and there was another senior who was also a German speaker. The flight was normal, and it's about an hour and three quarters. We landed at Stuttgart, and normally, as soon as you land, there's reverse thrust. So they land at 175 miles an hour, 150 miles an hour, something like that. They slam on the brakes, and that's a natural thing. But we landed, and there were no brakes, and I thought, well, that's weird. So I'm sitting at the front in the galley with another girl, and we're barreling down the runway, and I'm going, something's not right. And then suddenly, the brakes went full on, and the plane's skidding like this. The ovens fly open, the coffee's everywhere.
Oh, wow.
The passengers are white knuckling it, in the cabin. And we finally came to a halt, and the passengers kind of sat there still stunned. And I said, "Yeah, Sie können jetzt aussteigen. You can get off now." And they stood up and they said, "Hey, yeah, schöne Landung." I said, "Yeah, nice landing." I said, "Yeah, das ist ganz normal." It's just everything's normal. So they got off the plane, but the captain came out and he was just white and he said, "You don't know how lucky we are to be alive." And I said, "Why? What happened?" So he took me outside on the top step, and it's nighttime, but the plane's lit up, and the tail plane was hanging off by a thread.
Oh,
And the tail plane looked like somebody had beaten it up with a hammer, or a can opener. And he said, "I think it's been like that since Gatwick." And I said, "Well, don't you need a rudder to fly the plane? Because I've done some flying as well."
yeah, yeah.
He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, how do we make it?" He said, "I don't know. I don't
Wow.
know." And when we landed, the first officer was doing the landing, and he said, "I have no control." So he gave it to the captain. The captain had no control of the steering. But fortunately, they landed and we didn't have any crosswinds that night. So they just let it run down the runway as far as they could. And then they put on the brakes before we went into the terminal, like the movie Airplane.
Mm.
And
I've seen that.
thank God we stayed on the runway because he said we could have gone onto the grass and spun out and, burst into flames.
Wow.
So I definitely feel the gods were protecting us at that time. And as a result, they grounded all the comets worldwide, as they do when there's a plane crash on a particular aircraft. And there were three other comets that if they'd done like another 2-hour flight, same thing would have happened because it was metal fatigue. And there could have been fatalities. So we were the kind of the omen of, what might have been, but we survived it. Um, but it was kind of funny because the very next night there were very strong crosswinds right across Europe. We had to stay in Stuttgart for 3 days, and then we finally flew home on a BA flight on the Friday. And it was very, very windy. And as we're coming into Heathrow, the plane's rocking and rolling. And when we when it's like that, the pilots have to kind of slam it down. And he slammed it down so hard one of the tires burst, and so the plane went like this. And we were all freaking because we've just had this experience. So there were a few screams in the cabin that day, but we made it home.
Wow, well, thank goodness for that. But wow, definitely you have lots of stories to tell. Some, scary ones, some happy ones. Thank goodness you're
But
here. So thank you for being here with us and sharing all your amazing adventures in life. And that
you're
brings me
welcome.
to, do you feel that being a flight attendant prepared you in an unexpected way, maybe somehow, for your work in the metaphysical world now?
I would say so, Ava. I think um, I learned a lot about myself as a flight attendant because you don't, well, you have a senior on board the plane. It's not like you have a boss to report to. And in the moment when you're dealing in the plane, you're kind of having to be a problem solver, like right on the spot. You can't kind of run up to the front and say, oh, should I do this? You just make decisions on the spot and you hope you it's going to be the right decision. You work as a team, absolutely. Teamwork is very, very important. But a lot of times you've just got to make those split minute decisions. So I learned to, I think I was tuning into people going, okay, what's really going on here? When they were acting out, I'm sensing they're really afraid of flying. And I'd sense that, and I'd say maybe you'd like to go up the flight deck to just, talk to the captain and see how it all works, because people would do that. And once they understood why the wings are moving a little bit or this noise is doing that, they would go, oh, okay, okay. And they'd feel very comforted. That was often the case. If somebody was being very difficult on the flight, it's like the psychology is that they want the flight attendants to remember them so if there was an emergency, they wouldn't leave them behind in the aircraft.
Mm. Oh,
It's
wow.
interesting,
Yeah.
right? A lot of people like to drink because they're afraid. You never know what somebody is leaving or going to. It can be a divorce, a death, an illness. So you always have to learn to be, without knowing why, just to be compassionate with the person and kind of just calm them down and just say it's all good. How can I make you feel better without saying that? You just kind of find a way. So definitely tuning in. And I would say anybody that works with the general public, policemen, shop assistants, healers, of course, anybody that deals with a lot of people, they will, after a while, get a sense of who's who and what's what. So that kind of comes with the territory. I love dealing with people and with crew as well. They're fabulous crews. So I think those two things, like learning to be independent myself and gaining confidence in my own sense of intuition, if you will, or judgment, not really judgment, but knowing what to do. And the other thing is just kind of learning to about humanity and never ever judging anybody because all the different cultures have different rituals. And it's like, sorry, sir, you can't do that on this aircraft. I dealt with in Libya people who haven't seen a toilet before and they were like swishing themselves with water. And it's like, oh, we can't do that.
Yeah.
We've got electrics on this plane.
Yeah.
So, you've got to be very, it broadens your mind for sure.
Yeah. Open-minded too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the other reason why I wrote these books is because, especially now, everybody takes everything so seriously. They take themselves so seriously, and they're so judgmental about if you're different in any way, shape, or form. Well, news people, we're all different in our own way. We're all the same and we're all different. We're all individuals. And what a blessing that is that we have this diversity of personalities and people and languages and places. And it just makes, to me anyway, makes life so interesting. And you
Hmm.
can never, ever, ever stop learning. You can never, ever be bored because there's always something else that's
Yeah.
different and new. So I wrote these books, especially with a sense of humor and fun and love for humanity. And it doesn't matter what shape you are, color, race, gender. You're just a special divine being. And I think that's what flying kind of taught me how lovable we all are, especially when we're imperfect,
Mm,
especially when we mess up. I think the more imperfect we are, the more adorable we are.
yeah.
And I don't know if you meet too many perfect people. I don't think there is such a thing, but to me, it just made them more lovable.
Yeah. Wow, you said so many amazing things here. And I've been on a plane hundreds of times, right? And I never really looked at it from the way you've described it because I'm getting on that plane, either by myself with family, and I'm focused on my journey usually, right? Okay, I'm here, I gotta get through this. And for the most part, I love flying. And everything, it doesn't bother me, so I go do my journey. But I've never really seen it from the way you describe. There's say 100 passengers on the plane, and everybody has their own journey they're going through,
They
and then we're
do.
all in that one. I like how you said it. What do you call the plane? The whole thing.
The metal
Metal,
tube, thin metal tube in the
metal
sky.
tube. Yeah, like that.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, but I never really, it's like, yeah, maybe one or two people is like, oh yeah, they're going somewhere. But for the most part, I've always kind of like focus on my journey, what I'm gonna do once I get there and everything. But then the way you've said it is you like all these people on the plane, they're all on their own mission. One's scared, one's afraid, one's maybe going to funeral, one's maybe going to wedding. Never really seen it that way, and in a small space, for flight attendants to deal with so many personalities, it can be
Yes.
challenging sometimes,
Yes. Very.
and then to control it, especially in a panic or something, like if something happens. You guys have a tremendous, thing to deal with. And I applaud you for that, because I actually wanted to be a flight attendant at one point. I never got there. But I admire you, and
Oh,
the things you had to go through, and all the journeys, and then now you have some fun stories to tell as well, so that's
oh,
beautiful.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
Ava, I looked at my colleagues and I just loved them and I had great respect for them as well. And because they dealt with so many things. I have to tell you this one story, and this is out of the longest flight of your life, and this is actually the Lakers story, the uniform I'm wearing now. And we were on a flight from Florida to Gatwick, and it's just an example of how you don't know what's going on with people. So this man got on, and he's 6'3" and big guy, and clean shaven, and he's wearing what we call a tacky t-shirt, a kind of holiday thing.
Yeah.
And obviously going to the UK, he looked like an accountant going on holiday by himself. And he greeted me. I said, good morning, sir. He said, good morning. And he went and sat in his seat. And sadly, the senior on this flight had been very badly attacked in New York about 3 months prior. And this was her first flight back. And we were into the flight. We've served drinks. He did not want anything to drink. He did not want a headset. He did not want a meal. He didn't want tea or coffee or anything. And I sounded like his mother. I said, so you should have something to drink because you dehydrate in flight. It's not very good for you not to have water because it's very, very dry. And he just sat there and looked out of the window and said no and just grunted. And he kind of transformed from this friendly guy into this, like, no, I'm not going to talk to you or say anything.
Yeah.
So I just left him alone. I thought maybe he's come from a funeral, going to a funeral. Like I say, you just don't know and you don't want to pry. So just let him be. So I went downstairs for my break. We go down in a lift in the DC-10, and there's a big galley there. And I was having my meal, and Sandy, the IFD, came down, and she was just like she reminded me of Edward Monk's painting, The Scream. She was just like this, and I went, Sandy, what's going on? And she said this guy in A had just taken off his shoes and socks and tried to and broken one of the windows.
Oh.
So just so you know, you can't break a window in a plane because there are three panels. So the interior one is called the scratch panel, and it's very thick plastic. But still, you have to be very, very strong to break that. And then there are two more, which, unless you were Superman, you could not break, especially when the plane is pressurized at 35,000 feet. But the passengers in cabin A did not know that. They saw this broken window and they went, we're out of here. So they all ran down the back And this man was swearing and cursing about the movie, about the plane. And so I said to Sandy, I'll go, you stay here, I'll go up and deal with it because she was still traumatized. So he was saying, I've got to get to Venus and I know where we are because Jupiter's up there and Venus is over there. And I said, okay, yes. So I actually, or somebody went and asked the captain and told him, we have um, a dangerous passenger on board because you never know what they're going to do.
Hmm.
So it's unusual for the captain to come out of the flight deck. Normally they just lock it, which is not a bad plan because we want them to be safe and alive.
Hmm.
But anyway, this captain neither did. He was a big guy as well, lovely guy. And he came down, he locked the flight deck door, came down and sat by this man. And it was good because they were about the same height. So, there was a parallel there. And he put a seat in between this guy and he sat there and talked to him. And they looked like a couple of guys just having a beer on the deck on a Sunday afternoon. They were like chit-chatting very casually. And it seemed like it calmed him down. So Ivan went back to the flight deck, and then 10 minutes later, we got a call from him, from the captain, saying, check the starboard loo at the front. He's just gone in there with a big hold all, and he's in there for 30 seconds, and he's come out again. So, of course, even then, we were worried about bombs. We were always looking for, people with bombs and different things. So we scoured that loo. We couldn't find anything. And we just let him be in his seat. And everybody had left him alone in this cabin by himself. Anyway, for another 5 hours all the way to Gatwick, we just kept going, where is he? And he started to walk around the plane. And then as we were coming into land, about 10,000 feet, we were depressurized. He came and stood by one of the door that he actually walked through. And I thought, he could just lift up that handle if we're depressurized and the door would go, sorry, the door was armed. So the door would have gone psh, up into the ceiling and the chute would have either come out and outside the aircraft or come back into the aircraft, and this is an 80 long nylon thing, which could have, I don't know what it would have done. Anyway, a friend of mine was training on the flight deck, so he was wearing civvies, he wasn't in uniform. And he said, would you like me to come down and sit next to him? And I said, oh, yes, please, because we didn't have any air marshals or even guys on that flight. I don't think we had even any stewards. So Paul came and sat next to him. We removed the passengers from that door. We let him sit by the door just to kind of give him a level of comfort. And then Paul came and sat next to him. And when the announcement came on to sit down and fasten seatbelts, he did, which was good. But we called the captain had called the police and a nurse to meet the aircraft. And Sandy, the IFD, was supposed to hand over the paperwork to the ramp and this kind of thing, but she couldn't handle it. So she gave it to me. She knew I'd been a senior with my other airline, so she just kind of said, "Here, Natasha, you take care of it." I'm
Yeah,
okay.
take it. It's yours.
Thanks a
Yeah.
lot. So
Yeah.
she went downstairs out of sight. And the police came on and with a nurse, and they said, where's this man? And I said, he's standing right there. And he was just standing there like nothing had happened. And the scratch panel was lying on the side in two pieces. And the policeman was very short. And he said, can you tell me exactly what this gentleman has done? And I said, certainly. I said, he's been harassing the passengers, threatening the captain, and damaging the aircraft. And the scratch panel was lying there on the galley surface. So he went up to this passenger and arrested him essentially. Said, I understand, sir, that you've been doing this. And it's like I'd accused you, Ava. He looked at me like, you're kidding. Like, what are you talking about? And it just made me feel so sick because he just like completely out of it.
Mm.
Anyway, they took him off and he's going, but I got to get to Frankfurt. And I said, yes, we know that, sir. And they took him off.
I said,
And
you're walking. No, sorry.
yeah, exactly. Anyway, that was quite an eventful flight, and there were some other things going on, but I won't get into it. People can read the book and read the story. But
Yeah.
I
Wow.
think I called it not fully loaded, not fully loaded.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
because and sometimes oxygen on planes, lack of oxygen, because we're flying at essentially the equivalent of 10,000 feet, can affect the brain, and people just have meltdowns.
Yeah. Wow. Well, whew. I was like eagerly waiting for the ending as you're talking about the story. I was like, what happened? What happened?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this very exciting story on many different levels here. And thank you so much for being on Rise and Thrive, Natasha. And I've asked you
Thank you.
before about the intention we set for the day. Quickly, can you tell us how important it is to set intention in the morning for the rest of the day?
Well, I think it just defines your day. So I'm writing a screenplay right now, and they say right from the first scene, you've got to set the tone. And to me, setting intention is setting the tone. Are you going to be in gratitude? Are you going to be grumpy? Are you going to be excited? Are you going to just set an intention to get things done and be satisfied no matter what you get done? Is just feel good about yourself, is what I think is important.
Wow.
Just whatever you get done, be happy that you got those things done. And the other things, they can wait another day.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your amazing stories. And believe me, I could sit here and listen to you all day, and I'm sure others too. Again, we'll post all the links in this video so you can reach out to Natasha if you have any questions or want to buy her book. It'll all be there. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and I truly hope you have an amazing day. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Ava. God bless.
Welcome. Thank you.